All right, so we're ready to talk about round 3, which is style. And I'm very excited to talk about this because it is probably the only round the Iron 883 has the potential of winning. This is a very difficult category to discuss with my audience here because style is very subjective and really depends on what you value as what looks cool and what does not look cool. Now, if you've been following me for a while now, you would know that I chose the Iron 883 because I love the look of it. So within style, we're not just going to talk about its attractiveness as a motorcycle. I mean, that plays a big factor, but I also want to talk about what type of rider looks good on that bike. As you know, like for a motorcycle, depending on the seat height, depending on your rider's triangle, you can kind of look funky on it, whether you're too big or too small for that bike. So let's get right to it.
Round 3, fight!
All right, so let's talk about the attractiveness of the Iron 883. To me, the Iron 883 is kind of a time capsule for Harley Davidson. It's kind of locked in between the eras of like 1960s to late 1970s, maybe even bleeding into the 80s a bit. But the Iron 883 is just a classic looking bobber. And I want to say like the first Sportster design kind of came in the late 50s when the Harley Davidson had the K models. And I'm going to go in a little bit detail on the history of the Sportster on a different episode, but for this one I'll just touch on just a little bit of the design. So preceding the K model, the Sportsters were born, but the first iteration of the Ironhead, which is what the Sportster had, it's a bit more of like a regular cruiser with bigger fenders in the front and the back. You can kind of see the iron in it, but the bike design kind of spoke like a dad bike. And back then it was cool because it's one of a kind. But really where it started taking off is the 70s and the 80s when the new iteration of the Sportster came out with the Ironhead that had a real bobber design. And ever since then, people started modifying the look of that Sportster. And I think that just kind of started up the real fan base of what a Sportster really is. And the Iron 883, when it came out with the Evolution engine in like mid 80s, it really stayed in that design until now, really, which is why you will see a lot of Sportster S haters coming from Sportster owners because they really kind of changed the design of what it means to be a Sportster. But for me, when I picture a classic cruiser, the look of the Iron 883, that's what I have engraved in my mind, like someone riding it in the 70s or an 80s era movie type. And I was always kind of attracted to that look. I was born in the 80s and I never really grew up with motorcycles in my family. So as a young child, I would watch movies that had that type of bike in it because the setting was done in the 70s and in the early 80s. And that design of a bike just kind of stayed with me. And I'm so glad that Harley Davidson decided to keep that look for the motorcycle where you can actually still buy a new bike that looks exactly like from a bike magazine that you see from the 70s and the 80s. And to a certain extent, still have the exact same engine as well. So I always find that kind of cool to connect to and very positive thing for the Iron 883. In terms of how you look on the Iron 883, I kind of touched on it on comfort when I showed you the side profile of the rider's triangle. And for me, I find that because of such a low seat height, which is about 26 inches off the ground, it would fit a lot of riders that are under 6 feet. And for that, I think you would look actually pretty comfortable on it. But if you're taller than 6 feet, I do believe that some people may look a little bit too large on the bike. Like for me, I'm 5'10", about 190 pounds. And when I first got on the motorcycle, I had Steve take a picture of me because I really wanted to know what I looked like. And when Steve took that image for me, I looked at it. At first, I wasn't really used to seeing myself on a motorcycle, so it kind of shocked me a little bit. But when I looked at it in a little bit more detail at home, I was starting to second guess whether or not the Iron 883 was a good fit for me because I did look a little bit large. For some reason, I feel like I was dwarfing the bike just a bit, and I wasn't sure if that's what I wanted. So then I kicked it back on YouTube and tried to find all these motorcycle review videos that showed the rider on the motorcycle from a side profile that had a very similar stature as I did and try to kind of guess what I would look like in long term. And I was not able to do that, which is why anytime you see my motorcycle review videos, you'll see me doing a side-by-side comparison for every bike, just because that was the number one curious thing I had in my head before I got my Iron 883. I kind of digressed there, but what I wanted to get to was, as a person who's 5'10", I felt a little large, but after a while riding, I kind of started to get used to the idea of what it looked like and how I felt on the bike, and it felt perfect. I know there are certain mods out there that you can change the Iron 883 so a taller rider can actually go on it and still look really badass. But this Battle of the Sportsters is not talking about mods. It's just strictly comparing the different types of Sportsters at its stock stage. So in terms of how many people can look cool on the Iron 883, I would say anybody below 6 feet you're good to go. Anybody above 6 feet, you'll just have to do a little bit of a mirror check and potentially spend extra money on upgrades to make the bike more fitting for you. So with that said, what do I give in terms of score for the Iron 883? I'm gonna give it a 9.
Iron 83 wins. Fatality.
Maybe a little bias here, but I really fell in love with the style of the bike and everything about the motorcycle. They stayed true to that time. Like I said, it is a time capsule back in the 70s and 80s that Harley Davidson decided to still keep and still generate business out of it because it sells fast. Doesn't matter if you got all these Hondas, Yamahas out there that generates a motorcycle that looks similar and performs way better than the Iron 83, but I guarantee you that the Iron 83 still outsells because everybody copied the design of the Iron 883. And the fact that you can modify it to make it even more to your liking, to your character, it definitely scores high. And I think 9 out of 10 is a very fair score.